Hey, this is Pamela Bruner, and I'm on Musicians on the Record. Hit it.
This is huge, musicians on the record. Bring it on.
Hi, welcome to Musicians on the Record. I'm your host, David Ward. You've heard the music, now hear their story. I am so excited to have on the show Pamela Bruner today. And Pamela, I just want to read a little bit here. You are a Celtic harpist and transformational business coach. And of course, full disclosure, you're my business coach. You've also released 17 albums, which you can find on YouTube and PamelaBrunerMusic.com. And you are the author of several books, including Play the Harp Beautifully. And you've guest performed with the Chieftains, and with your husband Dave, you have designed and made harps at Heartland Harps. So excited to have you. Welcome, Pamela.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. That's great. So can we start a little with your musical story, and how did music start for you?
I grew up a musician, that like kitty trading on the piano kind of thing, and then took up the cello actually when I was about 10 or 11 years old. And for a while I thought I was going to be a professional musician, and I thought cello was going to be my instrument. And then as I got further into high school, I was like, you know what, I like cello, but I don't like practicing all that much.
Right.
And so, music was part and then not part of my life for about 10 years, but I love to sing. And I said, I want to find an instrument to accompany my voice. But, everybody plays guitar. I don't want to be a guitarist. Yeah. And at a Renaissance festival, I saw people playing, small Celtic harps, and I thought, that's it. That's my instrument. So at the ripe old age of 27, I took up the Celtic harp, taught myself to play it, and created the career that you described a few minutes ago.
Wow, that's amazing. I didn't realize at 27. So the cello came first. Any other instruments?
The piano was actually my first instrument, and the harp is such a close cousin to the piano. If you play piano, taking up the harp, you have to learn the technique, of course, but there's a really direct correlation.
So were there any teachers for you? Were you self-taught? How did you learn how to play both the piano and cello?
Yep, teachers, the sort of, piano lessons as a kid. I really did like playing piano, and I loved classical music. And then when I took up cello, I had the great good fortune to be in a school system with a really good orchestra program. And in fact, we had, I don't know, the first or second best orchestra in the country by some standard. I don't know what standard.
Wow, that's great.
I was going through high school. And so it was a great opportunity to play in a group and get that incredible energy that comes in playing with an orchestra. And it's one of the things that I loved best about playing cello was some of the music we played, that you get really excited. I got excited playing things like Night on Bald Mountain, which is, I think, one of the great short orchestral pieces. Or, I remember playing the Brandenburg concertos and just getting really excited about that kind of music. So that was the course of my original musical training was classical. But then once I left that, sort of went to Celtic and folk and never looked back.
Right. Yeah. So you had a mix of that inspiration then. Yeah. Anybody in your family, were they musical? Were they supportive of your music?
My parents were always supportive of most everything I did. My mom played a little piano. My dad couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. Yeah. But they were just always supportive of me.
Okay. And so when you announced at 26, 27 to say, I'm going with the harp and I want to do this professionally, they were on board with that too?
They didn't have a lot to say about it at 27. I'm sure they would have been on board had I asked, but I didn't ask anybody.
Okay.
I just, it's a wonderful story about the Renaissance Festival where I saw my first harp.
Yeah.
I still remember the group there. It was in Washington, D.C. The group was called Voice of the Turtle. I don't even know if they're still in existence. But I bought their cassette. There were cassettes at that time.
Yeah.
And I talked to them after the performance, and I was so taken with the harp. And they had these tiny little, like a 26 string, which is about the smallest Celtic harp that you can get. And I didn't know at the time how extraordinary it was. But they actually loaned me a small harp for a month so that I could try it out. And at the end of that month, I found my first harp used that I purchased from somebody for $500. And I performed on that harp for a number of years. That's why I taught myself to play on. I started performing on that harp. And then when it was time for my first sort of more grown-up instrument, a full-size Celtic harp is 5 full octaves. Okay. And when I bought my first full-size Celtic harp, I bought it from the man who would later become my husband.
Ah, interesting. Well, we can certainly curious about that story too. I guess first I'm wondering, what was it about the harp that called to you so strongly at 27 that you wanted to pursue that professionally?
I didn't know that I wanted to pursue it professionally at 27. I was a computer programmer at the time, and pretty happy being a computer programmer, but I loved performance, I loved Celtic music, I loved dressing up for the Renaissance Festival, and so one of the first things that I wanted to do was to teach myself enough songs on the harp that I could audition for and perform at my local Kansas City Renaissance Festival, which I did. So I probably shouldn't tell this story, but
please.
I had taught myself about 30 minutes worth of Celtic music, and I'd gone to the KC Ren Fest every single weekend, paid to get in the front door, and I'd participated, but I hadn't brought my harp and I hadn't performed. And the very last weekend, on the very last day, I thought, if I don't do this now, and so I took my harp. And I actually snuck in the back gate and snuck through one of the vendors' booths and went out there and set myself up in the very back corner of the Renaissance Festival. And one of the vendors was a sweetheart. He's like, well, if you're going to sit out there and play, you gotta prime the pump. So he got a basket and he put some coins and some dollar bills and put it in front of me. That's great. And I sat there for about 5 hours and played the 30 minutes of songs that I knew over and over and over again. And, I made $30 in tips that day. It was so exciting. And after that, I did it legally. I went auditioned for the Renaissance Festival and became an official performer for the Ren Fest after that.
That's great. I had the vision of you sort of storming the gates at Woodstock, but it was the Ren Festival with the harp. That's fantastic. Had you heard harp music before? Did you have inspiration or favorite performers on the harp, or was just this random thing that came into your life?
It was a random thing from the Renaissance Festival. In fact, I like to joke when I started doing harp and voice. The harp community, especially the Celtic harp community, is fairly small and close knit. And I made a name for myself with harp and voice because there weren't that many people specializing in it.
I see.
And for the first few years of my playing the harp, I never ever played an instrumental piece. Everything I played was using the harp as an accompaniment for my voice. So I was experimenting with all sorts of techniques and creating techniques. How do you make a harp sound like a guitar? It's easy to make a harp sound like a harp, but if you want a harp to sound like a guitar or like a drum or something like that, how do you do that?
Yes.
And there are certain accompaniment techniques that you can use to give a very sort of guitar-like accompaniment sound. And I ended up putting those in a book called Harp Accompaniment for Vocals that sort of got spread out in the harp community. And then finally, after a few years, I got the nerve up to actually learn how to play an instrumental piece on my harp. And after that, I did a mix of both vocal and instrumental. But I kind of learned backwards. Most people learn to play the harp, and then they learn how to accompany their voice on it. I did it backwards.
Right. So you're saying you could play something like Star Spangled Banner by Jimi Hendrix on the harp?
The problem is bending notes is actually, it's not hard to bend notes on an orchestral harp, which is called a pedal harp. But bending notes on a Celtic harp is much more difficult. So I am not a pedal harp player.
Okay. And are there electric harps?
There are electric harps.
Interesting.
Yes. And the electric harps usually have a pickup on each string, just like an electric guitar does.
Sure.
And they can come in the Celtic version or in the pedal harp version. Just a little bit of background, because it's going to come in the conversation here. Yeah. Distinguishing between the two kinds of harps, people think generally in terms of size, like Celtic harps are smaller and the orchestral harps called pedal harps are huge, but they're actually different musically. The Celtic harps, also called lever harps, the strings of the harp are the same as the white keys of the piano. C's are red, F's are blue, but if you look at a harp and you understand keyboard, you will see the keyboard in the harp strings. The way that you get the black keys on the harp is on Celtic harps, you raise a small lever that's on one string, and when you flip that lever up, that string goes from a natural to a sharp.
Interesting.
And so on the harp, or at least the Celtic harp, you can't change keys that quickly because you can flip a lever up in the middle of the piece, but you're not going to be flipping like crazy.
Yes.
Now, the orchestral harp, also called the pedal harp, does the same thing the levers do, but it does it with pedals.
I see.
So when you move the C pedal, all the C's go to C sharp or C flat. You move the D pedal, all the D's go to D sharp or D flat. So you can change keys quickly using your feet. And the finger technique is the same on both harps. It's just the pedal harp, it's a little more complicated to play because you've got the foot action and it is more chromatically diverse. You can do a whole lot more different kinds of music on it.
Absolutely. You got more limbs doing different things at different times. I get
Exactly.
it with the drums, so which is challenging. Yeah. So when was that moment for you then, Pamela, that you said, okay, I want to do this professionally and getting into more performing and/or with 17 studio albums, that's quite a lot as well. How did that moment happen for you?
There was a moment where I said, I want to perform, and then there was a moment when I said, I only want to do this. And those were two different moments.
Okay.
So the moment that I wanted to perform was basically as soon as I got the harp. I'm like, I want to learn to play this, and played at the Renaissance Festival. And for a number of years, people would say, oh, do you want to be a full-time harpist? And I would say, only if I want to make $7,000 a year. Right. And it was my short-sightedness, because after a few years, when I met the man who would become my husband, Dave Woodworth of Heartland Harps, then we said, what would it be like if we started doing this together? And we would do art shows, and I would sell my music and I would sell his harps. And maybe there's actually a way to, he was a professional harp maker and had been for a number of years, so he was making a living at it. I was looking at, is there a way for me to make a living at this? Yeah. And a lot of it was based on CD sales. How could I sell enough CDs to do this? And it turns out the art show circuit at the time was actually a really good way to do this. So when he and I joined forces and I started doing the art show circuit, I pretty much had to create a new CD or two every single year just to keep going back to the same venues and having somebody go, what have you got new this year? And I'm like, this is the new one. Right. Here, these are the ones you want. And so it was when I met Dave and started thinking, wow, could I actually do this and make enough money and make a living at it?
Yes.
That I said, okay, now I no longer want to be a computer programmer. I just want to be a professional harpist. Wow. And that was the turning point.
It's an amazing jump right there. Can you say a little bit about your first experience in the studio making a CD at that point?
Oh, I think I've blocked that out from trauma.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. Actually, I do remember, because it wasn't a CD, it was a cassette at the time. Okay. And it was so awful. Oh my gosh. It's not one of the ones that's currently for sale. It was so awful. I went into the studio. This was when I was making my very first cassette for my very first Renaissance performance. Yeah. And, it was like, all the money that I have is enough to buy 3 hours of studio time and to duplicate 50 cassettes. And it's like, so I have to record my entire album straight in 3 hours and then duplicate cassettes. Yeah. Oh yeah, I wish I could say that I pulled it off, but I did, in the sense that I actually created the cassette. But yes. I just went in there and we set up a microphone in the voice, a microphone in the harp. It's like, hopefully I don't make enough mistakes that I have to stop, and let's go for it. And so I did. I made my first little 45-minute cassette or something like that in 3 hours. And I have to say several glasses of wine were involved.
That's okay. It's like a musician's life. I get it. Yeah.
But, there were people who really enjoyed that cassette and came back the next year to buy the next cassette, which was considerably better.
Yeah. Well, I imagine it was a learning curve for you, because some of the stuff that we've talked about is, how to deal with stress, nerves, anxiety. What was your learning curve, both performing and in the studio? How did you overcome those obstacles?
In the studio, one of the things I learned to do was use technology to help me get the results that I wanted. Yeah. So where I know a lot of musicians like recording their albums live and the performance is part of it and everything. Yeah. After that first initial album, I really went to more of a sort of a checkerboarding, assemble it and make it all fit together, especially because a lot of my albums have cello and woodwinds on it. So we would actually record separately. Okay. And then I would act as producer and layer the sounds the way that I wanted them. Okay. So at that point, there's a lot of forgiveness, because it's like, okay, I'm going to play it, and if I don't play it well, I can play it again, and I can play it again. Right. And so that's a very different thing. In terms of performance, I never really suffered from stage fright, but I did occasionally suffer from shaking hands, which is a very bad thing if you're a harpist. Right. Yeah. And always the interesting thing to me was I loved being on stage. I wanted to be on stage. I wanted to be performing for people. So why on earth are my hands shaking? Right. And just trying to get myself to a calm place. But I noticed that the difference between shaking hands and non-shaking hands usually had to do with my preparation and how prepared I was. And whether I was to the point where I was bored with a song in practice. Because I wouldn't be bored with it in performance. Right. But if I wasn't bored with it in practice, that's when my hands would shake. If you were not bored with it. Correct. Right. I needed to practice it to the point where I was bored with it in practice. Yes. And then I could be comfortable with it in performance. Absolutely. Because you had it down. You had it in your conscious, subconscious, right? Yeah. Right. Okay. So can we talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced in your music career, times of discouragement or fears, anxiety, any times that you felt like you just wanted to even give it up? Yeah, I've got a story about that. I don't know that I wanted to give it up except for a couple of hours, but it became one of the most critical turning points in my entire music career. I entered a competition at the Lion and Haley Jazz and Pop Harp Fest. And this was a competition designed for Celtic Harpists, lever harpists. Okay. So even though it was jazz, it was designed for I was entering against people who were playing my kind of harp. But it wasn't my genre. And I worked really, really, really hard on that competition because it was my genre. Yeah. And I remember I learned the song Someone to Watch Over Me, which I now can no longer play. But they also had an improv part, so they'd give you a piece 24 hours before the competition. You had to arrange it and everything. Wow. So, yeah, and I must have worked on that one piece for, 8 or 10 hours that day. So it was like I really worked hard. Yeah. And I knew as soon as I was in, I think, the middle of my first piece that I just wasn't playing well in the competition. I knew I wasn't playing well. And the only thing I can chalk it up to now is that I didn't have that genre in my bones. I had the Celtic genre, I had the folk genre in my bones, but I didn't have the jazz genre in there. And the last song that I played in the competition was actually an original of mine. I would call it contemporary American folk. And I played that song. And when I played that song, I knew, like I hit it. Like, that was awesome. And the lead judge, who was a woman that I have admired greatly before and since, Deborah Henson Conant, one of, I think, the best harpists alive today in the country. And she came up to me and she said, when you played your original, that blew me away. She said, that's what, that's the thing. That's the ticket. And I walked away going, I know I didn't win the contest. and turned out I didn't even place. Like I really played badly. But later that day at the conference, I went to an open mic, played that same song again, original. And later in the conference, a man came up to me and he said, when you played that song, you gave me the words to tell the person who is most important to me in the world. They mean to me.
Wow.
And I'm so grateful for that. And in that moment, I thought, I'm not entering any more competitions.
Right.
I said, I don't need the competitions to do what I do.
Yeah.
I need to share my music with people.
Yeah.
And after that, I went on and recorded 17 albums and created, a successful business, and it impacted a lot of people because it ceased to be about the competition and started to be about the transformation.
Absolutely. And right to the heart, it sounds like, right? Yeah. It's fantastic. Yeah. Can you give us a glimpse as far as your creative process? Because clearly it sounds like you know how to read and write music.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I read music, I write music, and I play improvisationally too. So
yeah, amazing. And would you say that that's a pretty important component of music, to be able to read and write music?
I know a lot of people who are great musicians who can't read and write it. Yeah. So I can't sit here and say, oh, if you can't do that, that would be inappropriate and untrue, I think. Yeah. I love having the flexibility to be able to play something by ear or improvise with something, and also pick up a piece of music and read it off a page because it's a quicker way to absorb it. So I like the versatility of doing both, but I think that opens new worlds, but I can't say that one is better than the other.
Sure. Yeah, there's many gifted musicians who can't read or write music who can play incredibly. So can you give us a glimpse, though, of your creative process when you were in the studio or you're sitting home or somewhere developing this music, writing these songs? What kind of frame of mind would you get in? How would you prepare for that?
It depends on whether we're talking instrumental or vocal. So I'll tell you a little bit about both. If I'm doing a vocal piece, I'll almost always start with the lyrics, because to me, the point is all about the lyrics. So I will do something like I will write until I get either a chorus or a verse that just feels rock solid, and then I'll make everything else fit that rhythmically. But often after I've written that first verse and I love it, I might start setting it to music because it's going to be easier to get the rest of the lyrics once I have the music down. So that's the process for a lyric-based song. And if I'm working on instrumentals, this is where I think space and the tactile experience is so important, because I was going to say harp is such a tactile instrument, like what musical instrument isn't?
Right.
But just noodling around and listening for the phrase or the hook or the something that just goes, oh, that's beautiful. I think that's a really fun thing to do. One of my albums called Here Be Dragons is harp and African drum with a bunch of really cool viola mixed in. And it's all improvised in a certain way. And here's what I mean by that. I was actually looking for and sort of meditating on what I should do for my next album. And I was hiking up one of my favorite mountains, and I literally heard a voice say harp and African drum. And I stopped and I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Like I do Celtic music. What's this about African drum? Yeah. But I used the web. I went on the web and I Googled African drum rhythms, and I got this training site that just, it was where you could learn all of these different rhythms. And so I started playing these training rhythms and started improvising to the training rhythms. And what I did was I got motifs. And so, I'd have like a 6 or 8 or 10 note motif, and that would be the basis for the entire piece. And so each one of the pieces was based on a different African drum rhythm. And then I would spin out the motifs as I would play them more, and I would start making them sort of fit into 16 stanza things and stuff like that. it all started with, let me just noodle along with this really cool, exciting drum rhythm.
Wow, that's amazing. That must be a pretty exhilarating experience to go, you're really birthing music, so to speak, where it's just coming from nothing, and at the end of it, you have a song or an album.
It's really cool, and it's even, you get kind of the two-phased creative process, because you've got this sort of noodling little thing, and then you've got to turn it into a song. And if you're doing an improv album, which I've done several of, I would go into the studio and I would have just like jazz improv, where you've sort of got your bass tune, and then the next time through that you play it, you're improvising on the chord structure or something like that. So I would go into the studio and I would play the bass tune, and then I would noodle or play chords or something like that several times through. And then I brought in my violinist and violist, who's R.A. Frankfurt. He's just brilliant improvisational Scandinavian musician who also plays in all these other genres. And I had this vision for the album, so I would have him improvise on all these sections, and he'd go, he listened to it and he's kind of like, this is really a mess. And I'm like, trust me, it's going to be great. And he left the studio still confused. And then I sent him the finished album. He's like, oh, I didn't know it would sound like that. I'm like, yeah, because I would move his tracks around and make them all fit.
Yeah.
So, and since my engineer was a drummer, I had him play all these different African drums on the album. So it was very much an organic experience of just laying down all these things, but then they fit together like puzzle pieces.
How many would you do performances or in the studio with others usually, or just on your own, laying down different tracks and then they would come in and do different tracks?
I only did one album in the studio where I was actually in there with the other musician. Mm-hmm. I did an improvisational album with a flute player where we did work in the studio. One of the things about the harp in a studio is no matter how soundproof the different booths, you almost always get bleed over. And with the harp and the ring of the strings, it's very hard to cut things in.
Yes.
It's almost impossible to edit in. So I actually came up with a checkerboard way of recording the harp, where I would play a section, like play the A section, and then I would just let it ring as though the piece were over. Mm-hmm. And then I would come back on a second track, and I would start playing the B section. And so I called it checkerboarding because the recording looked like that. Yeah. But it was a great way to look at segmenting, also to get sort of perfect performances on the harp as part of the recording. And it made it very easy for my musicians to plug in.
Yes, absolutely. And thankfully the technology was available for that, right? Yeah.
Yes. I love piecing things together in a studio. It makes me happy.
Right. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about some favorite performances? I mean, you played with the Chieftains, so I don't know, that sounds like a good one to me, but can you say...
That was a pretty cool performance.
Yeah, how did that come about?
When the Chieftains were touring, it turned out that they would send out invitations, and this was actually before the internet. Okay. They would send out invitations kind of through the grapevine to local musicians who wanted to join them on stage, like for the last number. Yeah. And I heard about this, and I took my harp down, and I don't think a lot of harpists tended to join them. I think it was more like, oh, I've got a baron or something. Right. I got a pipe here. I could. Yeah. But when they taught to us, and I had my full-size Celtic 5-foot Celtic harp, and Derek Bell, who's since passed away but was the harpist for the Chieftains, he looked at me. He's like, "Wow, it's quite a harp." Yeah. And he said, "Can you play along with a piece? If do you need music, or can you just chord along?" And I said, "Well, I can chord along. I've trained myself to do that." Mm-hmm. And so I wish I still had it. I don't. But he wrote out the chords to the Celtic piece, "Give Me Your Hand," on this little piece of paper. And so I took it backstage and I kind of practiced it. And I'm like, can I really do this? Yeah. And it was the next to the last song. They actually pulled me on a song early. Mm. And we started off with a duet with me and Derek Bell playing this piece. Wow. And then at the end of us playing it, everybody came in and joined us. And then it got faster and went into a dance thing, and they had dancers come on stage. It's really super exciting. Yeah. And it was because I trained myself to do all this accompaniment that I usually did for the voice, but that I could do with him. Yes. And I remember when we finished the piece, as we were in front of 1,000 people, which for me at the time was a pretty darn big audience.
Yeah, big crowd.
And Derek Bell turned to me and he said, "That's the best it's ever been done."
Wow.
And I was so excited. And I wrote up the story of that evening. It's like the night I played with the Chieftains, and it was published in the International Folk Harp Journal. And it got me the introduction to my first International Folk Harp Conference as a performer.
Wow. And where was that? That's an awesome story, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The performance was in South Carolina, where I was living at the time. The conference was in Monterey, California, which is actually where I met Dave, my husband.
Oh, can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
And so you were already obviously performing and had some albums, and he was already making harps, or how did that happen?
Well, I was his best customer, and his best referral source. He would say, "Call Pamela in Kansas and ask her about my harps, and she'll tell you all about them." And I would say, "Well, from a player's perspective, this is why you will like these harps." And so I don't know. I had 3, 4, 5 of his harps, a couple that were my performance harps and a couple that were rental harps for students because I was teaching. And then I went to this conference in Monterey, and we got together at that conference. And then I said, "Okay, sweetie, now let's talk about designing the harps so they become even better."
Yeah, right.
And so we redesigned the look of the harps and made them sort of more elegant, more streamlined, upgraded some of the woodworking details on them, and upgraded the whole line. Yeah. And that was really exciting. And then we I guess it was about 8 years ago, Dave decided to create the world's first all carbon fiber super lightweight harp. Wow. So just like carbon fiber guitars or carbon fiber cellos, nobody had created an all carbon fiber harp before. So he took that on, and after a couple of years went to making only carbon fiber harps, and that's what he does now.
Amazing. Those sound beautiful and lightweight.
Super lightweight, yeah. The Celtic harp, which is usually 25 or 30 pounds in wood, is 10 in carbon fiber. Yeah. The pedal harp, which is 90 pounds in wood, is less than 40 in carbon fiber.
Wow, big difference. And sounds beautiful still, I imagine, right?
It sounds beautiful because carbon fiber is super thin and very resonant. So it makes a really nice resonating chamber.
Absolutely. So when you were performing and in the studio, and it sounds like going to festivals and traveling, touring basically, what were some of the ways you took care of yourself while doing that?
I didn't.
Okay. All right.
That sounds awful, but it's not entirely true, because I think a lot of musicians really don't take care of themselves. And I still got plenty of sleep, and I still ate right, and I was never much of a drinker, and I never did drugs. And so, just getting enough sleep and exercising and eating relatively well, I'd say qualifies as taking pretty good care of yourself.
Agreed. Yeah. For you, Pamela, whether the harp or any other music, who are your favorite musicians, performers? Who really inspires you?
Well, as I said, I love Deborah Henson-Conant. She actually plays pedal harp or orchestral harp. She's very, very avant-garde. She's also a great singer. So she's done both harp and voice albums and harp albums. Kim Robertson is, I think, arguably one of the best Celtic harpists ever. She's also super creative, and I learned a lot about how to embellish, how to improvise, and just how to interpret in a way that's a little bit off, in a way that just captures the ear. And in fact, I remember talking to my boyfriend long before I met Dave, who was actually a drummer. And so I would sometimes play the harp, and he would play the drum with me. I remember I was just about to give up the harp because the Celtic harp, it's chromatically limited. You can't play in all keys. You can't play a lot of accidentals. And I was just like, I'm not sure that I can really express myself on this instrument. And then a friend of his gave us the album Treasures of the Celtic Harp, one of Kim Robertson's very first albums. This was 20 years ago or something like that. And I played that album, and I listened to the incredibly creative performance on that album. And I said, am I kidding myself? You can do anything you want on this instrument. There's a huge arena for creativity on this instrument. I'm not giving up this instrument. And 10 years later, I was on stage with Kim Robertson.
Wow, fantastic. Holy cow.
Yeah.
Amazing. Goodness. That must have been a favorite as well, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So.
Wow. Can we talk a little bit about how do you handle mistakes while performing or in the studio? Because I hear a lot of musicians struggle with that. How do you deal with that?
When you're performing, the way to handle a mistake is to smile.
Okay.
So, because for one thing, most people won't know whether you've made a mistake or not.
Yes.
And if you're playing, I mean, I've played my share of weddings, and if you make a mistake playing, Pachelbel's Canon or something like that, most people will actually know that. But what they will look to you for is, how do you feel about the mistake? Because if I make a mistake and I wince, then they will feel uncomfortable. I mean, just people do that. They're empathizing with you.
Yes.
If I make a mistake and I smile, like I have compassion for myself, or I'm indulgent, or the same way you would smile at a little kid or something like that, then they're getting the message, oh, it's okay to just keep enjoying this and it's fine. So that's like the easiest musician hack in the world, is if you're performing and you make a mistake, smile. In the studio, I think that mistakes in live performance are a lot easier to deal with, because if you don't comment on them or you don't give weight to them, they come and they're gone.
Sure.
People are going to remember the beginning, they're going to remember the ending, and what happens in the middle. If you actually record your mistakes, then the thing to do is decide, is this a mistake or is this actually a feature or an improvisation?
Right. Yes.
And, what I would say is sometimes the performance is so good, you just hold on to it, mistakes and all.
Absolutely. Doesn't have to. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. I have wrists that tend to click a lot.
Okay.
Like some people crack their neck, my wrists click as I play.
Yeah.
And so I when I'm recording in the studio, it's almost impossible, well, it is impossible as far as I know, to set up a microphone in the harp that does not capture the clicks.
Sure.
Even if you try to put the mic in the harp body or something like that.
Right.
So, after a while I was just like, this is part of the performance.
That's right.
There's no way around.
That's part of your music, right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. When you were performing and making albums, how did you balance everything? Work, life, relationships, friends, family? That's a struggle for a lot of people, I think.
I think that the people who actually have very clear balance in their lives are people that, for the most part, have either already created success or lead kind of boring lives. I think that when you are creating success, it's sort of like when you're walking. You are never balanced when you're walking. You're always on one foot or you're the other. Yeah. So as you're creating success, in any business endeavor, including music, that when you, there's the pendulum is going to swing to, there were a few years when I was traveling 38 to 40 weekends a year, Thursday through Sunday. I would come home Sunday night. I would stay home for a couple of days. I would paint the harps, because that's the other thing I did when Dave was making wood harps, is I would paint Celtic decorations and flowers on the soundboard and stuff. And then I would go out and do it again over the next weekend. And there's no balance in that life, but there's a lot of passion.
Yes.
And so the question is, are you engaged in something that you're really passionate about in a way that fulfills you at the time? And when that ceases to be true, then find another way to be passionate.
Right. And you certainly did find another way to be passionate, another major life change for you, because you went from computer programmer to musician, and then from musician to transformational business coach. Can you tell the story about how that happened?
Yes, I was teaching at the major harp festivals around the country, the harp conferences, and I was teaching harp and voice. I was teaching how to practice, which I was pretty good at, and then I was also teaching something called Creating Music with Love, Not Fear, which was basically performance anxiety workshop. And I loved teaching that workshop. It was my favorite one to teach. And I started thinking about it, that why am I sort of living to teach this workshop 2 or 3 times a year at the conferences instead of finding a way that I can do this all the time? And so I created a mantra that goes like this: Spirit knows how I can do what I love be with those I love and make more money than I ever imagined. I accept that path now and I have the courage to walk it. And I said that mantra every single day, and I would go on a walk and I would say the mantra up as I hike up my hill in North Carolina. And after a couple of months, someone said, well, why don't you try coaching? And I said, what's coaching?
Right.
And so I researched it, and that was it.
Wow. And pretty quickly, that became very successful for you. Ended up working with Jack Canfield, creating a book and DVD system. How did that come about?
Well, once I started seeing that I was going to be leaving the music world, at least in the sense that I had been in it, I wanted to leave a legacy for two reasons. One, I wanted to leave a legacy, and I felt like I had a pretty good teaching system down. And two, I wanted to help my husband, because one of the things that I heard over and over when I would do these art shows, and I would market the harps to people, and I would sit people down for 30-second harp lessons and show them how they could play Jesu Joy or something like that. They would say, well, I'd love to buy a harp, but let me go see if I can find a teacher so that I know I can learn to play. And I thought, you know what? I taught myself to play, and I was very careful with technique as I was teaching myself. And so I would have like professional orchestral harpists come up to me and see me play, and they would say, oh, where did you study? I was like, okay, so I think I've got something here that I can share with other people.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to create a book and DVD series. When I created mine, the last one that was in any use had been created 20 years before.
Wow.
So there was nothing really in the industry that could take people really step by step. So I created this book and DVD series, and then a lot of teachers started using it because they said it just makes our job easier to have somebody who's gone over the step-by-step stuff and have a DVD that people can take home. And so it's still, that harp and DVD set's still out there selling. I still get royalties every year. I mean, not enough to keep my dogs in kibble, but
Right.
I still make royalties every year from that book and DVD series.
And so the teachers from school were coming to you, asking you for that, who had not ever trained with teachers. That's fantastic. And that is Play the Harp Beautifully?
Yep, Play the Harp Beautifully.
Wonderful.
Yeah, in fact, I figured that I'd scored my biggest coup ever with that when I was at a harp conference, and a representative of the biggest harp company in the world. They sell only orchestral harps, and the Celtic harp community is actually pretty nice and supportive, and the orchestral harp community tends to be a little more, I think elitist is the word that I would use.
Okay.
But this woman from this company came up to me, and she said, she kind of looked down her nose at me and said, if someone says, can I learn to play the harp without a teacher, we tell them no. But if they insist that they can't find a teacher, we tell them to get your books.
That's great.
Great. Okay, wonderful.
That's fantastic. I love it. So, I mean, that's a way for you of teaching on a global level with that book and DVD series. Have you ever taught just individually or groups with the harp?
Yeah, I mean, I love teaching harp workshops because it's a really easy way to share, and it's always easier for someone to see flaws in another person's playing than it is to see them in their own. Yeah. So workshops are a great method to teach. I never did group training outside of conferences. I would teach workshops at conferences and things like that. But I did have a studio and did one-on-one harp lessons for quite some time. And if I were still in the harp world, I'm sure I'd be doing them on video Skype.
Yes, right.
Because I think, technology now supports having training anywhere around the world.
Absolutely, yeah. What would be, just for example, say the first thing, if a new student came to you wanting to learn the harp, what would one of the first things be that you would teach them?
It's interesting because the harp position is actually a really relaxed position with the hand, and I can tell people to sort of do this gentle fisted motion where the thumb goes on top of the fingers like that. And if you can do this gentle fisted motion, that's the first thing I'm going to teach you. And then we're just going to put a string in the way.
Yes.
And you're going to do that. So
Yeah.
So there you go. Harp lesson 101.
I got it. I can play now, right? It's great. So, but very similar, I mean, different, but similar to drumming of like, learning different hand techniques to begin with. So great. What advice would you give anyone who, whether young up-and-coming musician or someone, 50s or 60s, wherever they are in their life, who wants to pick up the harp and start playing? What advice would you give them?
Absolutely do it. And here's why. The learning curve on the harp is, I think, one of the gentlest learning curves of any instrument out there. You pick up a violin and you're going to screech for a little while. And it's, coming from a cello background, it is uncomfortable to play a stringed instrument where you need to push the strings down on frets. Even guitar can be uncomfortable.
Yes.
But a single note or a very simple piece sounds lovely on the harp. So in terms of sort of instant gratification, it's a great instrument for that kind of, for instant gratification. You don't have to become a virtuoso in order to sound good. It's a really great instrument.
Absolutely. That sounds great. Now, obviously, with your coaching and your work with Jack Canfield and others, you use EFT for working with people with stress or trauma or anxiety. Can you talk a little bit about EFT and how also that applies to music?
Absolutely. I actually love EFT, which some people call tapping. Let me define it first. It's a simple self-administered acupressure technique that's been scientifically proven to calm the amygdala, the fear center of the brain, and lower the cortisol or the stress hormone levels in the bloodstream. So when you tap, and it looks kind of odd, and you're tapping on spots on your face, what you're doing is you're sending your body, your subconscious mind, signals to calm down, so that anything that you're entertaining, whether it's I have a performance coming up later and I'm nervous, or what are they going to think of me, or something like that, those thoughts can be sort of reframed in your head. And I know that you're familiar with tapping, David, but I want to make sure that to explain it. I am such a big fan of tapping that I actually put it in the third Play the Harp Beautifully book, because once we got to the third book and we were talking about techniques, I knew we were dealing with advanced concepts and people would be looking to perform, and I wanted to give them a technique that might help them be able to perform with less anxiety. Wow.
So how did you put that in there? In what context?
Just a couple of pages with a diagram, and here's what you do, and here's what you say, and so there's a small chapter on EFT in the book, and said, if you're nervous about things, this is something you might want to try before you perform.
That's fantastic. Would you be willing to give us a little demonstration on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
On EFT, okay, and maybe imagining someone who is some stage fright, or whether going into the studio, some performance anxiety.
Sure. So there's so many different ways to do EFT, but one of the things that stops people or stumps them as they're looking at doing tapping is because it's a modality where you tap and say things, they say, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. And so I think the best thing that I can do is to demonstrate, two different ways that you might calm yourself down with tapping that are both pretty simple.
Okay.
So I'll first show the points, and then we'll go into how you might use this. Great. So you can use either hand, doesn't matter, whichever hand's free, and you're going to tap on some points, and I'll just show them. And you can Google this stuff on the internet and see the points if you forget them.
Sure.
But top of the head, then eyebrow point, which is the start of the eyebrow either side, outside of the eye, under the nose, what they call the chin point, which is right here between the chin and lower lip. The collarbone point, I'm going to have to take off my scarf to do this, which is right here on the outsides of the two bony protrusions. And then there is another point, which is under the arm. You can't see that on the video, but it's down on the side, under the armpit, about 4 inches. So those are all the points, pretty simple. And the way that I like to tell people to do it is it's called tap and rant.
Tap and rant.
So tap and rant.
Yeah.
So you would rant about your fears. We're so used to pushing down the emotions that we don't want to feel, pushing down the things that we are afraid to come up. This is where you actually get to to speak them and to give them voice. So I would tap around just talking, almost as though I had picked up the phone to call my best friend, and I were just going to tell her everything I'm feeling. I am so nervous about this performance. And then tapping her. I'm so scared thinking about it. I'm afraid they're going to throw Rotten Tomatoes. No, they're just going to hate me. They're going to give me bad reviews. I'll never want to pick up my instrument again. And so you're just giving voice as you tap through all these points to everything that you're feeling. And a lot of people will assume, oh, I'll just tap a few points and it'll go away. Actually, I find that if you tap for 5 or 10 minutes and you keep looking for what do I feel, what do I feel, what do I feel, that you'll eventually get to a point where you say, okay, I'm not sure what I feel, or I'm not feeling as nervous anymore. How did that happen? Because you've tapped through all the issues. The other way that you can do it, some people just aren't as verbal and they're more tuned into their bodies, tuned in kinesthetically to what's going on. So that is, I'm not going to confuse you with a lot of points. I'm just going to say tap one point. Collarbone point's my favorite.
Okay.
So I would just tap the collarbone point and I would look for, what do I feel in my body? Like if I were to say, how do I know I'm nervous? Well, I got butterflies in my stomach. Okay. So I'm focusing on the butterflies in my stomach. How many butterflies are there? Well, I think there are 10. Okay, what color are the butterflies? They are blue and orange. Okay, so then I'm like focusing on the butterflies. I'm not trying to change them. I'm not trying to get them to fly away. I'm just focusing on that feeling. Or I have a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. It feels like I want to sink into the floor. Okay, great. Tell me about that. What size is it? Is it steel or is it wood? And I just keep describing it and observing it. And as I do that, I find that that over time that sensation tends to shrink or even go away. So 2 different ways that you can use tapping. This is the simpler for the kinesthetics. If you like to rant and you're used to picking up the phone and calling your friend, you may want to try all the points and just talking through it.
That's fantastic. And also, is there a process of reframing or changing some of those fear statements into more positive statements?
There is. For me, tapping is just a modality. It's a way of accessing the subconscious through touch on the body. That what it's really designed to do is have us consider more empowering thoughts. And if you know the thought that you want to go to, like if you want to, it's not very useful to go to a positive thought like, I'm going to give a great performance, because you don't know whether you are.
Right.
But you might go to a thought that you can control, like, you know what, I choose to enjoy this performance no matter what. Now that might be an empowering thought. And if you enjoy your performance, you're more likely to be relaxed, and you're probably going to give a better one anyway. Right. The thing is, as much as I love the reframes, if you try to go to the reframe too soon, like I'm tapping, I'm so scared of this performance. I choose to enjoy this performance no matter what. And everything in your body is screaming, no, you're not going to, it's scary. You cannot go to that reframe too quickly. Yeah. I think that once you tap and you're in a neutral place, and then you're like, I don't feel scared anymore. I feel kind of foggy or out of it, or I'm not clear about what I've actually tapped to the point where I've forgotten what I was tapping on. At that point, I can start entertaining the positives, and that's what tapping is so powerful for.
Yeah, fantastic. So I think we've answered the question of what would you be doing if you weren't a professional musician anymore, transformational business coach, and very successful at that as well. So a couple of more questions, Pamela. Can I ask you, if your music could have one effect in the world that it could produce, what effect would that be? What would you want that to be?
Thank you for that question. I would want people to feel empowered, that they could do anything that they wanted in life.
That's pretty good. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. But do you have a favorite piece or album that you have written that's yours?
Gosh, I wish I'd given that some thought, because when you got 17 albums, that's a little tough.
Yeah, that is. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
It really depends on my mood, because some of my music is instrumental and some of it's vocal.
Yeah.
But coming on the heels of that last question about if your music could do one thing, what would it be? I wrote a song called Who I Choose to Be. And I wrote this about a year after 9/11. A lot of singer-songwriters kind of, picked up pen and paper after 9/11. I actually waited a year and then wrote this song that I love to sing, I love to perform, and that to me, I guess if I had to choose one, it would be that song. All about bringing peace and love to the world, no matter what other people are doing.
Absolutely. So people can go check that out on iTunes or PamelaBrunerMusic.com. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And for people watching in the future, Pamela, what advice or what recommendations would you give, whether they want to study the harp or any other musicians, what would you recommend to them?
I would say that if you act from your heart, whether it's with music or anything else you want to take up, act from your heart and follow your passions. Because I never thought when I took up the harp that I was going to be a professional musician and make albums and all that kind of stuff. I wanted to express myself. Please don't shut down your expression for any reason. Not because it's not going to be perfect or not because you don't know where you'll go with it or anything like that. Give your passion wings.
Fantastic. I love it. Pamela Bruner, thank you for being on Musicians on the Record.
My pleasure. Thanks, David.